Have you ever witnessed the extraordinary transformation that occurs when someone who has spent their entire existence absorbing pain finally decides to redirect that energy? Picture this moment when the person who has always been the emotional sponge, the eternal forgiver, the one who bends until breaking, suddenly discovers they possess weapons they never knew existed. This is not about revenge. This is not about cruelty. This is about awakening to a power that was always there, waiting in the shadows for the right moment to emerge. When the empath finally learns to wield the same psychological tools that were once used to diminish them, the entire landscape of power shifts in ways that can leave even the most seasoned manipulator speechless. What we're exploring today reaches far beyond simple role reversal. We're diving into the profound psychological phenomenon that Carl Jung himself would recognize as the integration of the shadow self. Jung understood that within every gentle soul lies a fierce protector, and within every giver exists the wisdom to know when to withhold. Today, we uncover what happens when these hidden aspects finally unite, creating something the narcissist never anticipated facing. The journey begins long before the first strategic silence or calculated withdrawal. It starts in that sacred moment when the empath's internal compass finally stops pointing toward everyone else's needs and begins orienting toward their own truth. For years, perhaps decades, they have operated from a place of endless accommodation, believing that love means dissolving their own boundaries to accommodate another's comfort. They have worn their sensitivity like an open wound, inviting the world to pour salt into it while calling it compassion. But there comes a pivotal instant when this paradigm collapses. The empath looks around at the relationships they have poured themselves into and realizes they are surrounded by empty vessels that only know how to take. They see clearly, perhaps for the first time, that their greatest strength has become their most exploited vulnerability. This recognition doesn't arrive gently. It crashes through their awareness like lightning, illuminating every shadow they had previously ignored. In this moment of clarity, something profound begins to stir. The empath feels the presence of aspects of themselves they had long suppressed. There's a part that wants to say no without explanation. There's a part that wants to walk away without looking back. There's a part that feels no obligation to fix, heal, or save anyone. For years, they had labeled these impulses as selfish, unkind, or wrong. But now they begin to see them differently. They recognize these as voices of self-preservation, whispers of wisdom they had been taught to silence. The transformation doesn't happen overnight. At first, the empath experiments tentatively with these new behaviors. They might respond to a text hours later instead of immediately. They might choose not to explain their decisions in exhaustive detail. They might decline an invitation without offering 17 alternative solutions. Each small act feels revolutionary because it represents a fundamental shift in their relationship with their own energy. What makes this evolution so powerful is that the empath isn't learning entirely new skills. They're simply redirecting abilities they already possess. Their capacity to read emotional undercurrents now serves their own protection rather than others' comfort. Their intuitive understanding of human psychology becomes a tool for maintaining boundaries rather than dissolving them. Their natural empathy transforms from a gateway for exploitation into a sophisticated early warning system. The narcissist, meanwhile, begins to sense that something has shifted in their carefully constructed dynamic. For so long, they have relied on the empath's predictable patterns of response. They know exactly which buttons to push to generate guilt, how much pressure to apply to create compliance, and precisely when to offer just enough affection to reset the cycle. But now these familiar strategies are met with something entirely unexpected: silence. This silence is not the sullen withdrawal of someone who has been hurt and wants attention. This is the deliberate, conscious choice of someone who has finally learned that not every provocation deserves a response. The empath has discovered that silence can be more powerful than the most eloquent argument. more unsettling than any accusation, and more protective than any defensive explanation. When a narcissist attempts their usual manipulation tactics and receives this measured silence in return, something fascinating occurs. They are forced to confront the sound of their own voice without the echo of reaction they have grown dependent upon. They find themselves speaking to a void, performing for an audience that is no longer engaged. This experience is profoundly disorienting because narcissists exist primarily through the mirror of others' responses. Without that reflection, they begin to question their own reality. The empath, observing this shift, realizes something extraordinary about the nature of power in relationships. They begin to understand that they were never actually powerless. The narcissist's control was always dependent on their participation in the dynamic. By choosing non-participation, the empath doesn't just protect themselves, they completely alter the game board. This awakening extends beyond mere silence. The empath begins to employ what Jung would call strategic withdrawal, a conscious choice to remove their energy from situations that drain rather than nourish them. When a narcissist creates drama, expecting the empath to rush in with solutions and emotional labor, they instead encounter empty space. The empath has learned to let others sit with the consequences of their own choices without feeling compelled to rescue them from discomfort. This withdrawal isn't cruel or punitive. It is simply the natural result of someone who has finally learned to distinguish between their own emotions and those of others. The empath stops carrying responsibility for feelings that don't belong to them. They stop managing the emotional climate of every room they enter. They stop apologizing for the discomfort others experience when faced with boundaries. Perhaps most significantly, the empath discovers the power of selective engagement. They learn to choose their battles not based on what others demand of them, but on what serves their own growth and well-being. This might mean refusing to participate in circular arguments that lead nowhere. It might mean declining to provide emotional support to someone who consistently dismisses their own needs. It might mean walking away from conversations that feel like interrogations disguised as communication. The narcissist, accustomed to having access to the empath's emotional resources on demand, finds this new selectivity deeply unsettling. They may escalate their tactics, attempting to provoke the familiar responses through increased intensity. But the empath, now operating from a place of integrated strength, doesn't take the bait. They have learned to observe these escalations with curiosity rather than reactivity, studying the patterns like a scientist examining data. This observation reveals something profound about the nature of narcissistic behavior. When stripped of their audience, when met with consistent non-engagement, these individuals often reveal the fundamental emptiness that drives their need for constant external validation. The empath, witnessing this revelation, feels not triumph, but a deep sadness mixed with relief. They see clearly that the person who seems so powerful, so in control, was actually trapped in their own prison of need. But the transformation goes deeper than tactical changes in behavior. The empath begins to reclaim aspects of themselves that had been surrendered in the name of keeping peace. They rediscover their own preferences, opinions, and desires separate from what others expect or demand. They remember what it feels like to make decisions based on their own intuition rather than others' approval. This reclamation process often involves what feels like rebellious behavior. The person who always said yes begins saying no. The person who always explained begins offering simple statements without justification. The person who always accommodated begins setting terms that work for them. To outside observers, this might look like the empath is becoming difficult or unreasonable. In reality, they are simply learning to exist as a complete person rather than a fragment of themselves shaped by others' needs. The psychological impact on the narcissist can be profound. Having grown dependent on the empath's emotional labor, they may experience what feels like withdrawal symptoms when this support is removed. They might attempt to guilt the empath back into their old patterns by claiming they are being cold, selfish, or cruel. But the empath, now grounded in their own truth, recognizes these accusations as attempts to reinstate the old dynamic. What makes this transformation so psychologically sophisticated is that the empath isn't abandoning their essential nature. They haven't become hard or closed off. Instead, they have learned to express their empathy in healthier ways. They still feel deeply, but they no longer mistake intensity of feeling for obligation to act. They still care about others, but they no longer prioritize others' comfort over their own well-being. They still offer support, but only to those who reciprocate respect and appreciation. This evolution represents what Jung would recognize as individuation, the process of integrating all aspects of the personality into a cohesive whole. The empath stops rejecting their own capacity for firmness, boundaries, and selective caring. They embrace what they previously saw as their shadow qualities, recognizing these not as character flaws, but as essential tools for psychological survival and growth. The impact on their relationships becomes immediately apparent. People who were drawn to the empath's previous willingness to overgive without reciprocation begin to drift away. Meanwhile, new connections form with individuals who appreciate balanced, mutual exchange. The empath discovers what healthy relationships actually feel like: energizing rather than draining, supportive rather than demanding, collaborative rather than extractive. Perhaps most remarkably, the empath finds that their capacity for genuine compassion actually increases. When they are no longer depleted by one-sided relationships and manipulative dynamics, they have more authentic care to offer those who deserve it. Their empathy becomes more precise, more intentional, and ultimately more valuable because it comes from a place of strength rather than compulsion. The narcissist, faced with this transformation, may go through several stages of response. Initially, they might attempt to intensify their usual tactics, believing they can force the empath back into familiar patterns. When this fails, they may try different approaches: charm, promises of change, appeals to history, or threats of abandonment. But the empath, now operating from integrated wholeness, remains unmoved by strategies that once would have sent them rushing back to repair and accommodate. In some cases, the narcissist may attempt to find new sources of the validation and control they once extracted from the empath. This transition period can be challenging for the empath, who might experience guilt or concern about the narcissist's apparent distress. But they gradually learn to distinguish between genuine suffering that deserves compassion and manufactured crisis designed to manipulate them back into servitude. The empath's journey towards psychological sovereignty doesn't end with learning to mirror narcissistic tactics. It culminates in transcending the need for such tactics altogether. They discover that true power lies not in manipulation or control, but in the ability to remain centered and clear regardless of external pressure. They learn to respond rather than react, to choose rather than comply, to engage rather than submit. This transformation has ripple effects that extend far beyond the original relationship dynamic. The empath begins to apply their newfound wisdom to all areas of life-work relationships, family dynamics, friendships, and even their relationship with themselves. They become more discerning about where they invest their time and energy. They become more selective about the voices they allow to influence their decisions. They become more protective of their peace and more intentional about their growth. The ultimate irony is that by learning to employ what appeared to be narcissistic tactics, the empath actually becomes less narcissistic than ever before. They develop a healthy relationship with their own needs without becoming self-absorbed. They learn to protect their energy without becoming selfish. They master the art of boundaries without becoming closed-hearted. This represents true psychological maturity, the ability to care for others while also caring for oneself. As this transformation completes, the empath realizes they no longer need to think strategically about dealing with narcissistic behavior. because they are no longer attracted to or available for such dynamics. Their energy signature has shifted so fundamentally that manipulative individuals simply cannot gain purchase in their emotional ecosystem. They have become, in essence, narcissist-proof not through hardness or cynicism, but through wholeness and self-respect. The journey from unconscious empathy to conscious compassion represents one of the most profound psychological developments a person can experience. It requires courage to face the parts of themselves they had denied, wisdom to distinguish between love and enablement, and strength to maintain boundaries even when others resist them. But for those who complete this transformation, the reward is nothing less than psychological freedom, the ability to love without losing themselves, to care without being consumed, and to remain open-hearted while also being clear-minded. This evolution ultimately serves not just the individual empath, but the collective healing of our relationships and communities. When empathetic people learn to value themselves as much as they value others, they model what healthy interdependence looks like. They demonstrate that true caring includes appropriate boundaries, that genuine love requires mutual respect, and that lasting connection depends on individual wholeness rather than codependent fusion. The empaths who undergo this transformation become beacons of possibility for others trapped in similar dynamics. They prove that it's possible to keep your heart open while also keeping your power intact. They show that sensitivity and strength are not opposites, but complementary forces that, when combined, create something beautiful and unshakable. They embody the truth that you don't have to choose between being loving and being free, because the deepest love always includes respect for the sovereignty of all involved. What started as learning to use narcissistic tactics becomes something far more valuable, learning to transcend the need for any tactics at all. The empath discovers that their greatest power lies not in strategic maneuvering, but in authentic presence, not in clever responses, but in clear boundaries, not in winning games, but in refusing to play them. This is the ultimate victory, not dominance over another, but mastery over oneself. And in that mastery, both the empath and everyone they encounter discovers what relationship can look like when it is based on truth rather than manipulation, strength rather than neediness, and love rather than fear.